Well, Teflon Don does it again. Donald Trump has just dodged the last viable attempt to hold him legally accountable for his many crimes before he assumes the presidency. And this stands in stark contrast to what's going on in Brazil, another Western democracy, which has to deal with its own version of Trump, and they have taken a very different path. In America, I think we might be doing it wrong. And I've also got with me the one and only Luke Beasley of The Luke Beasley Show, who just crossed, by the way, 1 million subscribers. I think 1 billion is on the way. How's it going, Luke?
It's going very well. As I always say, much better now that we're talking.
100%. And so before I get Luke's, take on this, I definitely want to show you a clip recapping. This is from Fox News, so I guess we're going to have to enjoy a bit of Schadenfreude. You can hear the happiness in their voice as they report on this stay of sentencing, this indefinite stay by Judge Merchan. Take a look.
Fox News alert now and some developments in the hush money case of Donald Trump in a New York City courtroom. The New York judge, Juan Merchan, has granted Trump permission to file a motion to dismiss that case. He's already said that he was going to delay sentencing for a little while. He says now that he is going to delay sentencing even further. How long this goes on is anybody's guess at this point. Obviously, the judge is going to consider this motion to dismiss. Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan DA, agreed that Trump's attorneys should have an opportunity to file a motion to dismiss to be considered by Judge Merchan. But here's the thing, is that Bragg and his office are willing, if Judge Merchan does not grant the motion to dismiss, Bragg and his office are willing to wait until January 20th, 2029 to resume this case. They said that they're willing to put it on hold for more than 4 years and then start it all back up again when Trump leaves office. I mean, that is, by any stretch of the imagination, unprecedented in American judicial history. So very soon, we don't know when Trump's attorneys will file this motion to dismiss, but we should hear very soon. And then we'll get Judge Merchan's decision on it after who knows how long.
All right, Luke, so before we get into the contrast with Brazil and Jair Bolsonaro, the Trump of the tropics, as he is well known, let's talk about this situation first, which is, I mean, he just is. Donald Trump is the luckiest man to ever walk the earth. He is Teflon Don. This was the last opportunity to hold him accountable, and he will almost certainly just moonwalk right past it. What do you think?
This is one of the things. Well, let me back up. I try to induce hope and optimism where I can, where reasonable, in doing my show, right? And definitely in the lead up to the election, there were all of these dark elements of Trump doing as well as he was doing. But the fact that he could very well have lost made the hope discussions very easy to have. And then he won. And there are still optimistic things. I was just having a conversation with a couple people talking about what's beautiful about us being present, our audiences, and the millions of people who voted aligned with our principles. There really are millions of people out there who see what we're saying. It's not that we're yelling into an abyss, and we can still make positive change even in this dark moment. But some stories make me want to get into the fetal position and never leave and just give up. And this is one of them, because how, especially, which is what you're about to walk through, the contrast of what can happen right now, not sometime in history, right now, what can happen when people attempt coups. How do you, as a country, allow someone to, on their way out of office, actually try to stop the whole democratic system altogether, keep himself in power despite the democratic will of the people, commit crimes while trying to do that, allegedly, not really, but, and then not be held accountable? And not just that, it's not like all right, you know what, that was crazy, that whole coup thing was crazy, but you go play golf and we're not going to mess with you. Instead, we go, well, not only are we not going to hold you accountable, you get to be president again after violating your oath of office as president while you were president last time, like few presidents have ever done. And maybe there's some situation he leaves office and he's held accountable, but man, that is a dark, dark story and a stain on American history. And if we can prevent MAGA from ultimately rewriting history, what people will learn about is the injustice that we're currently experiencing right now.
Yeah, and the other interesting thing is I'm thinking about all the various attempts to hold Trump legally accountable. So there were 4 major prosecutions. You had the New York one, which is this one. You had the Georgia RICO case, which is, basically on life support's going to be going away, no doubt. You have the 2 Jack Smith indictments as well. 3 of these things were never put in front of a judge and a jury, which is its own issue that I personally lay at least much of the blame on Merrick Garland, the current attorney general, who I think is a good and honorable man, but was not the man for this moment. He has the prosecutorial mindset of a judge, this stoic, impartial, I'm just going to sit back and be reactive. And he needed to have the mindset of a prosecutor, which is what he is as the attorney general. You're not a justice on the Supreme Court. You are a prosecutor. You're supposed to have an aggressive, adversarial attitude. Fair, to be sure, legal, to be sure, but your job is to go after the bad guys, not to judge things. That aside, this New York trial, it made it to trial. There was a jury. There was a judge. And he was convicted on 34 felony counts. So justice, in theory, was teed up to be served perfectly. And yet, because of the Trump v. United States Supreme Court ruling giving sweeping immunity to former presidents like Donald Trump, that complicated the sentencing. And then you have the election on top of it. And even though District Attorney Alvin Bragg is trying or is lobbying to basically tell the judge, we'll hold off on sentencing until January 2029 after Donald Trump completes his final 4 years as president, I would be stunned if Judge Merchan agrees to that. It is unprecedented. It's presumably legal. Otherwise, Bragg wouldn't be proposing it. But I would be stunned if Merchan was prepared to say, you know what? Yeah, I can't sentence him now. He's about to assume office. But Donald, the clock is ticking. And on January 20th, or excuse me, whatever it is, 2029, when you are no longer president, that is January 20th, 2029, then you resume full citizenship. You're no longer president of the United States. You are as susceptible to punishment as anybody else, and we will sentence you then. I just doubt that that's going to happen.
Yeah, just super quickly, I know we have other things to get to, but thank you for specifying. I totally jumped over and skipped over what the actual reporting was about there, which is the conviction, the hush money conviction, and got right to the election interference cases that also we've learned the DOJ will be dropping because of the long-standing precedent that the DOJ doesn't prosecute sitting presidents. And that being more parallel to the Bolsonaro example was on my mind, but it is crazy that even the case that he was already convicted in, we're not seeing justice. It's just...
He's Teflon Don, man. He is. He is the luckiest person.
Phrase. Oh.
He is, but it's sad. It's
makes
so
him
sad,
sound so cool. Stop.
No, and the thing is, I mean, and we'll touch on this after we get through Bolsonaro, but I do want to go back to what you had to say about the stain on democracy and the stain on the American legacy. But I also want to play this clip of which will segue nicely because we're talking about Trump and we're about to talk about the so-called Trump of the tropics, Jair Bolsonaro, former president of Brazil. And this is what Donald Trump famously had to say about Bolsonaro.
And I just have to say that I'm very proud of your last vote and will be even more proud of your current vote, October 30th, because you have a chance to elect one of the great people in all of politics and in all of leadership of countries. He's respected by everybody. Other leaders, I can tell you, including myself, respect him at the highest level. President Bolsonaro, he is doing a fantastic job for your country. He's bringing it back like nobody could. And I just say he has my complete and total endorsement. He's a great man. He loves his country. And let him do his job. Brazil is taking a whole new place in the world. You're being respected all over the world because of your president. Don't lose him. Don't let that happen. It would not be good for your country. And I love your country, but it would not be good. So get out and vote for President Bolsonaro. He's doing the job like few people could.
So, Luke, again, perfect segue, courtesy of Trump himself. You have the, American authoritarian far-right leader who clung to power and tried to, prevent a peaceful transfer of power and potentially staged a coup with his Brazilian counterpart. And so for context here, I just want to say Bolsonaro lost his election to the current president of Brazil, Lula da Silva. And they actually had their own January 6th. It was just on January 8th, 2 days later in 2023. Okay, so 2 years and 2 days later, that the symmetry is staggering. But I want to remind people of what's going on here, the new development. Okay, and so I'm going to read this from Axios. Brazil's former president Jair Bolsonaro was formally accused of being involved in an attempted coup over his 2022 election loss to President Silva, the country's police announced Thursday. The proposed indictments against Bolsonaro and 36 others conclude the Brazilian Federal Police's 2-year investigation into the fallout from the election that the populist leader never formally conceded. Sound familiar, Luke?
Where did he learn that from?
Yeah, which saw his supporters storm the presidential palace and other government buildings on January 8th, 2023. Does that sound familiar, Luke? Quote, federal police concluded on Thursday the investigation into the existence of a criminal organization that acted in a coordinated way in 2022, which is when the Brazilian election was, in an attempt to maintain the then president in power, the federal police said in a statement. Okay, the final report has been sent to the Supreme Court with the request that the 37 individuals be indicted for the crimes of the violent overthrow of the democratic state, coup d'etat, and criminal organization. So before we get into what's happened to Bolsonaro between now and his election defeat, I just want you to react to that. It seems like they're taking pretty aggressive steps to hold Bolsonaro accountable for his crimes. What do you think? Like, you already start to see some similarities between Bolsonaro and Trump, and the fact that, you know, the Brazilian government is taking more aggressive steps to hold him accountable compared to ours?
Listen, I guess we technically indicted Trump too, and maybe Bolsonaro ultimately sees that case not lead to him actually being held accountable, as happened with Trump. It is so strange how the same story is playing out, but on two different timelines, and we're yet to see how the Brazil one actually ends. But from all I've read, to your point, it is being taken more seriously, and I don't pick up on the same pulse in the country that would jump in to prevent justice in the interest of Bolsonaro, right? As we saw here, Americans went, no, wait, let the coup guy go back in power. And
so to your, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go on.
Well, I was going to say, so to your point, to add some additional context. So Bolsonaro loses the election in 2022. Again, he never formally concedes, but he does order his chief of staff to go ahead eventually and begin the transition. Never formally concedes. President da Silva becomes president. And then a few days later, so this is one of the somewhat key differences. You know how January 6th was an attempt to stop the peaceful transfer of power? On January 8th, 2023, when Bolsonaro supporters stormed the executive building, the legislative building, the Supreme Court, they went after all the targets. Da Silva had already become president of the United States.
Brazil.
Excuse me. Yes, you're right. My geography there. He had already become president of Brazil. But here's what's interesting. The Supreme Court of Brazil took aggressive action. They removed key former Bolsonaro appointed executive officials, like the person responsible for the governor of the capital, for example, the person responsible for maintaining security. He was a Bolsonaro loyalist appointed to that position. They removed him from power. They're like, we're going to investigate you. We're going to see if you committed a crime, if you aided and abetted this attempted insurrection. But until we do, you're not going to be trusted with the levers of power. So see where the difference is already? The other branches of government said, while we investigate, we do not trust you to maintain power because there's pretty compelling evidence already that you either contributed to this or you allowed it to happen. So we're going to remove you from a position to make things worse. That was one major difference off the bat between the two countries that Our system of government permitted Donald Trump. Think about it. There wasn't an impeachment effort in the Senate, the Republican-led Senate, because they didn't want the political blowback. So we didn't have the impeachment trial against former President Trump until, number one, after he left office, and number two, after Democrats assumed control of the Senate. And then Republicans in the Senate said, well, we might have impeached him had he been in office, but he's a former president. You can't impeach a former president. So do you see how our system almost went out of its way to accommodate Trump? Whereas Bolsonaro and his loyalists, the Brazil took steps against them immediately. And then the last thing I'll say, the Supreme Court they barred Bolsonaro from running for office for 8 years while they continued to investigate his role in this potential coup and overthrow the Brazilian government. The contrast is staggering. Brazil's system is set up to actually react aggressively to threats against their democracy. We have failed that test. What do you think?
We really have. And our system of government and the institutions, I really do value both of those things. And I don't think people who have the burn it all down mentality are correct. Wrong. And I'm in awe sometimes of the complexities and the intelligence that went into structuring our system. What you learn, though, and what Trump's presence on the political scene has really taught us is our institutions ultimately are only as good and strong as the people that comprise them. And so when you have a Republican Party that has been consumed and eaten alive by cowardice and loyalty to Trump, either or, then there's not much that we can do. And that's why, when MAGA would say, hey, these legal prosecutions, those shouldn't be the solution. If you don't like Trump, it should be voting him out of office. It should be preventing him from becoming president. They were wrong in that you being a political candidate doesn't mean that you shouldn't be held accountable when you commit crimes. But it was true that ultimately the way that we ensure Trump didn't get power again was by doing so with our vote. And we failed. You and I didn't necessarily in doing our part, but us collectively as a country failed. And I remember, in school and after that in learning about history, one thing I say on my show a lot is that it's a lot more black and white a lot of times when we learn about it years and years later, right? The people who were in the right versus the wrong is much more abundantly clear than when you're in the middle of political or social strife. And I think when we read back on history, again, if the DeSantises of the future and the Trumps of the future don't rewrite it, then it's going to be so clear that we're living in a moment, as I mentioned before, where we as a country just failed and embarrassed ourselves on the world stage, which matters more than any other country embarrassing themselves on the world stage because of the influence that we wield and what bad actors our failures bolster. And this is one other point I want to make. The video you played of Trump reminded me of this, and the way that MAGA speaks about Putin now and Xi Jinping, the way that Trump does. Another scary phenomenon that's just loosely attached to what we're talking about here is that it used to be one of the things that I think made Americans feel pride in being American was that we put being American first and foremost, and then you have all the other things, right? Your particular background. Were you born an American? Did you immigrate? And all these unique places that we come from and backgrounds that we have. But first and foremost, we're American and we're united around that, no matter how different we can feel sometimes. But what we're seeing with MAGA is this shift toward the ideology that is, many of them don't acknowledge this, but it is authoritarian or flirting with authoritarianism. That ideology has become first and foremost. Their right-wing ideology has become their number one priority. And so then there's this scary alignment between the Trumps of the world and the Viktor Orbáns of the world, the Bolsonaros, and then going further down the authoritarian route to Putin. And where that ends, I can't tell you right now, but it feels bad that the proud telling I've heard it from Trump supporters of I'd rather be Russian than a Democrat, right? I feel more aligned with regimes abroad than I do with my own fellow Americans. And Trump's whole enemy from within thing is a part of that, that the enemy is worse in the country than some of our enemies abroad, terrorist organizations, authoritarian regimes, etc. That, I can't tell you where it ends, but it's scary that is starting to happen within MAGA.
I mean, brilliantly said. Yeah, it's a great point that Trump's, the connections, the incestuous connections between Trump and Bolsonaro. For example, when Bolsonaro fled Brazil, you know where he went? Florida, Mar-a-Lago. He spent quite a bit of time in Mar-a-Lago. And so Bolsonaro, Erdogan, Viktor Orban, Putin, these fixations with and this respect that they have, Trump and MAGA, for foreign autocrats, it really is disturbing. We've seen in poll after poll after poll that that Republicans, I should say, support Vladimir Putin more than President Joe Biden. And the last thing I'll say on this is just to your point. It's really frustrating when the expectation is always that when a Republican's in power and there's some sort of international or domestic crisis, be it in the form of a terrorist attack like September 11th or COVID, the Democrats, liberals, progressives, women, minorities, marginalized groups, you all are supposed to shut up and get in line behind this Republican president because, damn it, we're supposed to come together as a country. But when a Democrat's in power, that logic doesn't fly. I am perfectly convinced, and you may say this is cynical, but I think I could argue it pretty compellingly, that if we had experienced under President Biden some sort of, God forbid, a domestic terrorist act or another COVID, that Republicans would not be inclined to put partisan politics aside and patriotically support their president, even though the demand would be, if the shoe was on the other foot, that's exactly what you should do. That's something else that we're going to have to address. Otherwise, phenomenal points, Luke. Thank you for sharing that sort of insight in terms of it just goes deeper beyond specific examples and specific similarities between Trump and Bolsonaro. And I would just say that America has a lot to learn in terms of holding power to account from Brazil, because I guess the real last thing I'll say is this idea that holding leaders accountable makes us a banana republic. Quite the opposite. Japan, South Korea, other democracies will hold leaders accountable when they've committed crimes. That is actually the opposite, the antithesis of a banana republic, because otherwise what it suggests is your leaders are perpetually above the law.
Exactly right, Josiah. It is... that argument is one of the more triggering to me. By holding accountable all people by the same standard, you're a third world country. Well, then you don't know history. So cool.
Well, actually, let me ask you this. I'm curious because I have an answer to this because I'm sure you've been asked this question before. Okay, Luke, well, if you think Trump should be prosecuted, what if a prosecutor thinks that Joe Biden committed a crime and Barack Obama committed a crime? How would you feel if a prosecutor goes after them?
Please do it. I've actually said that, by the way, Josiah. I'd love when they threaten that. I used to go, oh, whoa, now you're doing the thing that you said was bad. Though you don't have credible evidence that they've accused, my mouth is not working, early morning recordings, Josiah, accused of, there's not credible evidence they've been accused of crime. So why are you acting like prosecution just because they're the opposite of Trump and their political role would be justified? And then I stopped making that argument, and instead, some Republican DA, go for it. Try. Because when there's not evidence, you're going to embarrass yourself.
Well, yeah, and again, but very true, but also you don't object. Clearly, you don't care if a Democratic politician, be it a former senator, former president, if there's compelling evidence that they committed a crime, you don't think there should be above the law.
Bob Menendez, Eric Adams, etc.
Yeah, it's so funny. I have to tell so many of the most diehard MAGA Republicans who throw this on me. I'm like, we're not alike. I have no particular attachment to Joe Biden or Barack Obama. If a prosecutor thinks that they have credible evidence that those former presidents or soon-to-be former presidents committed a crime, then feel free to bring a case. I don't have an issue with that. So it's so frustrating. And we could go on and on and on, but I will leave it here. Luke, where can people find you and your 1 million subscriber channel?
Make yourself 1,000,001 or wherever we are now by going to Luke Beasley on YouTube.
I appreciate it, Luke. Thanks for the collaboration.
Thanks, Josiah.